Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. We support at ADB many of the initiatives led by ADB, by APEC, including the Finance Minister's process and APEC Business Advisory Council. And over the past 2 years, we had the chance to follow the initiative to define a roadmap for improving the competitiveness of the services sector. And we look forward to continuing this work and supporting in any way the work that APEC is doing. I will just maybe focus on 3 key messages and some of them echo some of the main points that were raised at the beginning by our keynote speaker and also by Mrs. Aldaba in her presentation. One point I wanted to raise was first, the services have been impacted differently during the pandemic, as we saw from the previous session. And also, the composition of exports and services and goods is quite different across the Asian economies, and therefore the impact that they are experiencing during this period is quite different. However, we do see some common effects, in particular on the effects of certain services that have been impacted more drastically over the past year. And on the right-hand panel, we see, and it was presented already in our previous session, how travel and transport have been much more affected than, for example, other business services. One important point that I also wanted to raise is how, while services has been increasingly important, for example, for the contribution to employment, and we see this on the left-hand panel, we observe that across all regions in Asia and also globally, the contribution to services in terms of employment has increased over the past decade. However, we also need to understand that the role and contribution of services have changed over time. And if we consider, for example, the value-added contribution of certain services, we see that, for example, business services are increasingly important for the exports and for the export potential in the region. We see, for example, that they have contributed as an important condition for services-led growth policies. And a significant share of the growth in the value-added and employment of services today in the total economy is the result of business services, also because they have been also decoupling from the manufacturing sector. So while services are increasingly important, we observe an increasingly participation in employment, in the contribution to GDP, to exports. There have also been inner shiftings in terms of the contributions of different types of services to the economy. One important effect that it was mentioned in terms of the potential for economies to build on their services industries is on acquiring the necessary skills that are required. If we look, for example, at the share of digital services in services exports for the APEC members against an indicator of digital literacy that measures the ability, for example, to control or to manage ICT or to have access to digital tools, we see still that there is room for improvement. And empowering the digitally excluded segments of the economy and the population will be essential. This will require active policies, for example, improving the national academic programs, developing digitally focused initiatives for reskilling the labor force, and providing platforms for developing digital skills. We also, and it was mentioned already, we see that there continues to be an uneven basic digital infrastructure. Last year, we studied the issue of digital platforms in Asia, for example, and what we see is that in terms of penetration or network readiness of digital platforms, there is a wide variation across Asian economies. And here, the deeper tones show the different levels of access. And for those with poor access and infrastructure, we still need to redouble the effort to improve and reduce this digital divide. Finally, the last point I wanted to raise, and I think Mrs. Aldaba mentioned it in her presentation, is how FDI can be an important driver for fostering the services sectors. and in particular, those services that have been more resilient during the pandemic, which are digitally deliverable services. Most FDI in services in the Asia-Pacific region is concentrated on the mergers and acquisition mode of entry, which means that they are more market-seeking. And in the greenfield investments, we see less participation on services, which tend to have a larger effect on job creation, technologies, and skills transfer. This is why we think it's important also to look and consider the investment or direct investment on digital services firms as an important driver for the recovery. FDI in digital services has been relatively important during the crisis, and this is what we see in the lower panels compared to non-digital services. And we think that there can be some potential in the future for developing this. Finally, I will mention that if some governments have made efforts to make compatible their investment policy with their digital policies, more efforts could be made in terms of integrating the digital transformation into the investment policies, the investment initiatives that are being conducted already for many countries. I'll stop here and thank you very much for your attention.